So I got an email this morning from the computing center telling me that yesterday was the last day for people who wanted to abandon the class, and I looked at my new roster. My new roster has 22 students on it. I therefore had to look at the partner assignments for the Intelligence Squared assignment, and I have one more time reshuffled a bit. This is visible now in Google Classroom, so you don't need to frantically copy it down. It looks different from how it did before because there were so many situations where someone dropped, so I took both their partners and put them together, that I couldn't make the two spreadsheets work anymore. So when you look, you'll see your name is in this column, and then the two names next to yours are your two partners. You can further, if you're curious, you can scroll down to the previous spreadsheets. You will see names struck through, lined out. Those are people who took the opportunity and withdrew from the class. If your partner from before stayed in the class, they are still your partner. I did not take any partners away if they stayed in the class. If you have a new partner, it's because the partner you had before abandoned the class. That's the first announcement that I wanted to make. Here is my, and along with that, the deadline was going to be tonight to sign up for your debate. It's no longer the deadline. I am pushing the deadline back to next week because there are a lot of people with brand new partners today. If we have time at the end of class, a few minutes, I may dismiss class a little early so you can look and make contact with your new partner so you can get ready to take care of this assignment. We are about 4 or 5 weeks from the end of the term, and this should not be that lengthy an assignment as far as time. You have to listen to the debate, you have to talk to your partner, and then you have to fill out a form. And I say all that to say, I don't think you need to worry. I think we have plenty of time for you to get this done. I know you have other classes. I know many of you have jobs, but I think we're doing okay on time. So by next week, if you have not already, if you and your partner pick the debate that you want to discuss together and sign up by Wednesday of next week at the end of the day at midnight. And then Thursday of next week, I will go through, and anyone who has not picked a debate, I will randomly assign you one. But that's next week. That's my first announcement. Here's my second announcement. Next week is the deadline for you to submit your arguments for our first round of debates. The day that we are going to do fact topics. So, is Mount Everest the world's tallest mountain? Is clothing a reliable indicator of personality? That day of debates, those arguments are due next week. Let me also add, because we have 22 students in class, and because each student is expected to participate in 2 debates, that means over the 3 days that we are having debates, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, and 4 weeks from now, we're no longer going to have 3 debates each time. We're only going to have 2. Each debate lets 8 people participate, 4 on each side. So if we have 2 debates, that's 16. If we do that for 3 days, that's 48 spots to participate. And with 22 of you each doing 2 debates, we need 44. So I'm cutting from 3 debates to 2 debates. That leaves us more time to discuss the debates afterward. Now I'm going to ask all of you to listen carefully and be prepared to say after, what's the best argument you heard? And can you think of a way that argument could be even better? Because that's the discussion we will have to try to take what happened in the debate and make sense of it. But that's not next week. Next week you just have to submit the arguments on the fact topics. because then your classmates have a whole week to look at all those arguments and be ready to participate in the debate. The following week, 2 weeks from now, the arguments you submit for the value topics. Cats make better pets than dogs, and I don't remember the other topics. Those will be due 2 weeks from now, and the arguments for the policy topics 3 weeks from now. I'm going to stop here and see if anyone would like to ask me any questions about any of that. Before we get to today's, was that a, please, yes.
I have a question
Let me
of the debate we will have in 2 weeks later.
Right.
So there are 3 topics
Right.
on the list.
Right.
So you will tell us which topics we should choose, or we just choose them at our willing.
I was thinking about that on the walk over here. We have 3 topics for each week, but we're only going to have 2 debates. So what I think I want to say is, submit your arguments for 2 of the 3 topics, and we will look and see which of the 3 topics got the fewest submissions. And I'll assume that's one you weren't interested in. Okay? So the topic that got the most submissions, we'll debate that first. The topic that got the second most, we'll debate that second. And because they're due next week, you'll know a full week out which 2 topics we're doing, because I'll announce it on Thursday morning of next week. And you'll have a full week knowing it's just these 2 topics. Okay? The one other thing before we get to today's topic, which is comparing and contrasting argument styles and argument behaviors between the United States and Japan. I have one thing left over from last week. We spent the bulk of our time last week on the Toulmin model. Claim, warrant, grounds, backing, rebuttal, modifier. And one thing that I forgot to mention, you may know it already, some of you, in the United States, that is overwhelmingly the dominant way college students in writing classes, when they're first years in college and they take classes in how to write, they're taught the Toulmin model. And they're taught when you write an essay, write like that. Because young adults in the United States, fresh out of high school, if they have to write something, a report, whatever it is in the workplace, too often they'll just throw a bunch of thoughts together but not organize it. But if they turn it into a complete argument, in American workplaces, that is considered very effective writing. So when you are practicing using the Toulmin model and becoming familiar with it, it'd be good if you remember for the future, if you work with Westerners, this is a good way to write. Not just to get up on your feet and have a debate, but to write. And I'll finally add, 2 weeks ago, when we talked about argumentativeness and verbal aggression, I talked about how college professors who score high in argument approach get very good evaluations from their students. Students really seem to enjoy professors who teach in arguments. And one thing I know is a lot of people who go to college, even though they didn't plan to, they wind up teaching. If any of you ever become teachers, the Toulmin model is a good way to pull together a lesson. Here is my claim, the thing I want you to know. Here is my backing, Here's my explanation for why this backing supports this claim. So, as you are thinking about the Toulmin model, you could keep those things in mind. Today, the contrast in arguments between people from the West, primarily the United States, and people, if I don't drop my equipment, and people from Japan. The first thing I have been doing, and I want to do it again, is to walk you through the essay questions that will come out of today's talk. So you know them going in, and we'll review them at the end to make sure that they got fleshed out. The difference in orientation to logic that Japanese arguers and Western arguers tend to have. That will be probably the longest topic we talk about today. The difference in argument behavior that Japanese debaters show compared to everyday Japanese arguments. Some of the research that's been done was done by American debate coaches who would travel with Japanese college and high school debate teams and pay attention to when Japanese debate, when they do argument as playing a game, the third one, from when we defined argument, when they do it, how do they do it differently from American debaters? And there are some things to notice about Japanese debaters versus Japanese engaging in everyday arguments. There are some differences there that are important. So watch for those, and we will recap at the end to make sure they were clear. Third, the differences in Japanese and Western argument behavior that are influenced by Christianity. At the first class meeting, I spent about 10 minutes on the fact that I'm a Christian and some misunderstandings. I said that it comes up in the study of intercultural communication. The published research that I consulted for this talk, 3 different researchers pinned down important differences and said they are because the United States is very Christian influenced and Japan is not. So we're going to watch for those because those have a common root. Before we get into specific differences, I have 3 warm-up ideas. 3 ideas I want you to have in the back of your head, and we will then begin talking about the differences. Warm-up idea number 1. Anytime you talk about cultural difference, there's a danger that you have to avoid. Anytime you hear people say, well, Japanese people do this and Americans do this, they're making a mistake. I want you to think of a chef and a stand-up comic standing side by side. And I might ask, which one of them cooks? And you might say that one. And I might say, which one of them tells jokes? And you might say that one. But if you think about it, she probably makes food for herself some of the time. And she's a human being who's around other human beings. She probably tells jokes some of the time. It's just she cooks every day. It's very normal for her. She tells jokes every day. It's very normal for her. Sometimes, maybe she cooks. Sometimes, maybe she tells jokes. That's the relationship between behaviors that people from different cultures show very prominently. Let me put it like this. Anything that human beings do, human beings almost everywhere do. It's a question, though, of how often, how normal, or is it something you do only occasionally under specific circumstances? Americans argue a lot. Japanese people argue, just not very often, and not under ordinary circumstances. Japanese people pay attention to how other people are feeling and pay attention, careful attention to what's not being said. Americans do too, just not all the time. Usually only under real specific circumstances. That is background idea number 1. Here comes background idea number 2. This is specific to the field of communication. Back at the founding of the field of interpersonal communication, one of the big ideas was this. Every time two people communicate, they exchange content. When I say something to you, it has a meaning, a dictionary meaning. But they also, as they communicate, they also are recreating their relationship. So to make this something short that you could write down in your notes, all communication has a content dimension and a relationship dimension. All communication has a content dimension and a relationship dimension. Someone might ask, what day is today? And someone else might answer, today is Wednesday. That's the content. What day is today? Today is Wednesday. But now I want you to imagine it was a military commander who asked what day is today, and a soldier under that commander who said today is Wednesday. The soldier would probably say it in a very disciplined and respectful way to show that they were a good soldier, that they respected their commander. But then imagine the person who asked what day is today was a cute little kid. What day is today? And the answer came from the kid's mother. Today is Wednesday. Through her tone of voice, through her facial expression, she would probably, in answering that question, even while she said today is Wednesday, she would show that she loves her kid, she feels affection for her kid. She would answer that question differently from how the soldier would answer the commander. Tone of voice, facial expression, all of it would be different. The content would be the same. The relationship dimension would be different. One other way to think about it. I don't know if you have ever had someone who's hard to get along with, maybe a family member, maybe a teacher, maybe a neighbor. You've had them give you advice. They tell you what to do. And it's really irritating. And you're polite, but it's irritating. And then not long after, your very best friend gives you the same advice. And the content is the same. But you don't like the first person and you do like the second person, and it just looks different. So this big idea, every time two people communicate, there's content. The content dimension, but there's also the relationship dimension. One thing I'll say before I get off this idea. Sometimes we put the most emphasis on the relationship. You get together with someone you like and you haven't seen for a long time. The two of you will find something to talk about because you enjoy each other's company. It's not even that important what you talk about. It could be some program that the two of you both streamed. It could be a memory from long ago, but you'll talk about whatever to enjoy the relationship. In other situations, it's all about the content. I'm fond of all of you, and I have grown invested in you to where I hope you are successful. But when I come in here and do this, it's about the content primarily. There are some things I'm doing that show that there is a professor-to-student relationship that is happening, but my chief concern is that the content makes sense. So, one thing that's a big difference in arguing behavior between Americans and Japanese, how much attention is there to content and how much to the relationship in the middle of an argument? Third and final background idea is something that we call thinking systems. Thinking systems. There are two of them. Thinking systems. This comes from the work of a man named Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. Some things that we think about very carefully like we're doing a math problem. We consider all the information. We take our time. If you had a health problem and you went to the doctor and the doctor said, you should have very major surgery, I think you would probably want to know all the information and think carefully. If you were about to buy a house, if you had the money to buy a house, I do not have the money to buy a house, but if you did, you would think very carefully. You would think like this, very step by step and systematically. We don't do that most of the time. That's system one. System two, most of the decisions we make, we look for an easy pattern. One of the patterns is follow what other people are doing. There's actually a fair amount of research into this. What are the patterns that people follow when information is confusing and the thing that they're thinking about is not very important? If you're at a konbini and you want to pick up some chewing gum, I don't think you probably read the ingredients list and wonder how healthy it is. You probably grab the brand that you've chewed all your life, or you might see some that you saw a cool advertisement for and you think, that sounds interesting, and you grab it, and you don't think hard. That's system two. When we argue, sometimes there are moments when arguing when we follow system two, but most of the time the act of arguing is thinking very, very step by step and systematically. System one. So to sum up the background thoughts, what any human being does, every human being does from time to time. Communication has a content dimension and a relational dimension. And we sometimes try to think very systematically, but not very often. It's exhausting. And so if we can, we tend to follow patterns instead. And those patterns often have to do with what do we see other people doing, and how can we fit in with it. That brings me to where the rest of this came from. A couple of class meetings ago, you took a questionnaire that measured your argument approach and argument avoidance that had been translated into Japanese by Suzuki Shinobu at Hokkaido University. She's one of the researchers who studied how do Japanese people argue differently from people from the United States. Another one is a professor at Meiji University named Suzuki Takeshi. Now, I don't think they're related. The interesting thing about him is I've met him about 30 years ago. He went to the United States to go to graduate school and study argument. While he was there, he helped coach the debate team at the University of Kansas. And I was in college at the time, and he judged one of my debates. So I don't think he'd remember me today, and I barely remember him, but I have met him. Third, let me go back. No, that's not right. Terrible picture. I don't know why his chin is cut off. But from Yamaguchi University, this is Sekiguchi Yasuhiro. And then there are three more I couldn't find pictures for. From Seisen University, Oi Kyoko. From Takushoku University, Motoko Nagao. And from Otsumo Women's University, Satoshi Ishii. And I think I did all those backwards. Sorry about that. You might be wondering right now, what in the world are you doing? Let me tell you why I show you pictures sometimes of researchers, because I have had students over the years, not very many, but some, who have that gift where they never forget a face. And if they can take what they're learning about and connect it to the face of the person who's responsible for it, it sticks. and it fits into the narrative of their education a lot better. So for some of you, seeing these pictures may do you no good at all. But we may quietly in the room have some people who have a really good mental anchor when they can see pictures of researchers. Okay, I am going to take from about 6 different researchers from their findings. I'm going to boil this down into 4 major areas, 4 major organizing points of difference. The first one should be familiar from 2 weeks ago. Approach and avoid. Approach and avoid. There's a difference between Japanese arguers and American arguers in the approach score and the avoid score. That, I think, will be one of the shortest points of all. Second, probably the longest point, is the orientation to logic. The orientation to logic. The way Japanese arguers think about and use logic is different. And really, that's the first time, probably not the last time I'll trip over this. I'm talking to a room full of students from Japan and I'm saying Japanese are different, and that I don't think is helping you. My job today is to explain how Americans are different and try to give you a good look. How are Americans different? What can you expect? How can you adapt to the ways Americans are different? The reason that's challenging, all those researchers I just showed you, they did not publish studies talking about how Americans were different. They published in English language journals saying, this is how Japanese are different. So what I'm going to try to do, I'm going to try my best. I'm going to try to take the work they did and turn it around and talk to you about how Americans are different. But a minute ago when I said the Japanese orientation to logic is different, I tripped over it. I'm going to try not to make that mistake again. Third, there are differences in how American and Japanese arguers argue in conversation. There are quite a few. We will talk our way through them. And finally, as I mentioned in showing you the essay questions, there are differences in the way Japanese debaters, and these are, I believe, college debaters, although they might be high school debaters, at a tournament. There are differences in how they debate from how Americans debate. And what I'm interested in here is not necessarily Japanese debaters versus American debaters, but Japanese debate arguing versus Japanese conversational arguing. And also American debating versus American conversation. And in those differences, I think you'll start to get the picture of how this works. Let us then talk about approach and avoid. Approach and avoid. When we introduced this 2 weeks ago, we said that moment where someone says something and you know that they are factually wrong, and you know that you could easily explain how they're wrong, and it might even help them and help everybody if you pointed out their mistake. You come to that, and people have different temperaments. They have different traits, personalities. Some people have very high approach. They come to that moment, they're motivated to speak up. Other people come to that moment, I better not get into it. Most people have both motivations. They want to speak up, they feel like they better not. And if you have moderate approach and moderate avoid, you might sometimes do one and sometimes do the other. If you have higher approach, then when you're caught between those two impulses, you'll speak up. And if you have higher avoid, then when you think, I could speak up, but I don't know if I should, in that situation, you probably keep quiet. Suzuki Sensei from Hokkaido University collected data from a whole lot of American college students and Japanese college students and reported by a wide margin. Japanese college students have much higher avoid scores. They are a lot more likely to have the feeling, I'd better not. So what does this look like for how Americans argue and how that difference is going to look to you? You may have experienced it before, depending on how many Americans you have known. Americans will begin picking apart what you say, disagreeing with it and giving their reasons why, repeating back to you what you said and saying, but that's wrong because, and they'll do it at some of the weirdest moments. You do want to remember, though, the first idea I started with, what anyone does anywhere in the world, everybody does at least occasionally. So I should share this with you. There are certain situations that every American knows it's in very bad taste to bring up disagreements. When they are at a celebration, when they are together with their family on a holiday, if they go to someone's wedding. At American funerals, very often someone gives a speech called a eulogy. Right after a presidential election, the person elected president gives a speech called an inaugural address. Those are all examples where every American could tell you, those are about bringing people together. Those are about us all celebrating what we all have in common. And I think that probably sounds like a fairly Japanese idea. We are together. We have harmony. We want to emphasize agreements. Americans do it at celebrations, just not the rest of the time. So when they get together in a workplace to do a job, picking apart what one another says is appropriate. It's something that they were brought up to do. One other thing I should mention about argument. It's a big topic in the field of interpersonal communication. And the topic is self-disclosure. 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 When you meet someone and they're a complete stranger and you know nothing about them, but you think they might make a good friend, they start to tell you things that they like. You find out what city they're from. You find out that they're also a Tsuda University student. All those little facts you discover fleshes out who they are. In the United States, and even more in Europe, because this is only moderately true in the United States, it's very true in Europe, arguing is self-disclosure. Giving your opinion, your evidence for your opinions, that's showing the other person who you are. And commonly, people in the West are brought up thinking that's a good way to have interesting conversations and to show your friends that you are a thoughtful person, that you think about things, that you're an interesting person. So they'll have arguments and not worry about any damage to the relationship. They see it as strengthening the relationship because it's how you learn about each other. Now, I said that's only moderately true in the United States. The United States has become a moderately conflict-averse culture. And you'll find more and more Americans who say, I hate arguments, I stay out of all arguments. But you'll also find romantic couples who are dating, who are engaged, who are married. And they built that romantic relationship out of all the arguments they had. And they'll tell you they love arguing. A big root of this, according to Professor Nagao Motoko of Takushoku University, he said a big root of this, of the difference between approach and avoid orientation between Japanese and Americans, is religious. He said down at the roots of the teaching of right and wrong in Japan, the roots, not the explicit teaching, but Confucian ethics. The idea that there is a leader and there are followers, and good order consists of the followers support the leader. And he says that's rooted in filial piety. Good children need to respect and obey their parents. And even if you were never taught to be good Confucians, it's like what I said previously about Christianity in the United States and Europe. Even if the American you meet is not a Christian, Christianity is baked into their community. It's in their institutions. They were brought up with lessons about right and wrong that came from that. Speaking of which, Professor Nagao pointed out in the Bible, in the New Testament, you have poor people, people with no money and no power, over and over again, confronting and disagreeing with the people in power. Jesus didn't have any money. And the religious leaders kept telling him to stop what he was doing, and he would speak up and say, but you're wrong. Later books talked about Jesus' disciples. They went before the religious leaders. They even went before the government leaders and confronted them and said, you're wrong. So people who are brought up, either if they're explicitly brought up Christian or if they're brought up in Christian communities, argument is appropriate. Because the model they were given of right and wrong does not include you support the leader. It does not include filial piety. What it includes is, when you're right about an important matter of right and wrong, you confront the leader. So that's something you ought to be braced for if you're going to be around a lot of Westerners. So that's the first one, the first difference. Approach and avoid. The second difference is the orientation to logic. The orientation to logic. How do Americans think about and use logic and when? How do Japanese people think about and use logic and when? And one thing I was going to talk about back when I had the researchers' faces up here, it slipped my mind, so I'll do it now. As I talk about what these researchers published, they collected their data and published it, you might be thinking, oh, come on, I'm not like that. None of my friends are like that. But you have to remember this is social science, which means what they were doing, they might collect data from 2,000 or 3,000 people. And if they found there was a difference where 65 or 70 or 80% of the people in their sample responded one way, they would call that a very strong finding. Now, if it was 65%, that still means 35% didn't. But if 2/3 of a sample, a well-collected sample, respond a certain way, then something's happening. So if any of what I'm about to say sounds like a stereotype and does not apply to you personally, consider the fact that it may apply to a lot of the people around you. As far as orientation to logic, I wanted to start off with this one by having you use your imagination a little bit. I don't know how many of you like to watch movies. I have watched a lot of movies in my life. I used to watch more movies when I was in college. And I think you get the most enjoyment out of a really well-made movie if you just kind of go with the story. If the story kind of picks you up and sweeps you away, and in your imagination you're almost in the movie. And the movie ends and you think, oh, wow, I'm sitting here in a room watching a movie. I was actually living out the movie in my mind. It was a really good movie. But I had friends, sometimes in college, as we watched the movie, they'd speak up over and over again and they'd say, oh, come on, that's fake. He would never say that. Oh, do you see the clothes she has on? Those didn't exist back then. And they pick apart every mistake in the movie. And you may want to strangle them. Because what they won't do, they won't let the movie sweep them along. There's something, believe it or not, at the other college where I'm teaching a class on communication and story. And there's a big social science topic about narrative transportation. And stories can actually be very powerful, persuasive devices, but only if they sweep you away. You have to suspend your disbelief. Anybody can pick any story apart if that's what you've made up your mind to do. So I tell you this story about watching a movie with a friend who keeps picking the movie apart and won't let the movie just be the movie. But now imagine for a minute, let's say you move to a new town, far, far away, and you make a bunch of new friends. And the friends are all actually pretty wonderful. They're all really kind. They all do fun things. But you sit down the first time to watch a movie with them, and all of them are picking it apart. Room full of 20 friends you made, and all 20 of them are picking the movie apart. And you think, what is this? I didn't think this is what you did with a movie. But they're enjoying it. And they're talking to each other about holes in the movie. And at the end of it, they seem like they really enjoyed the movie, even though they only had bad things to say about it. If I were in that situation, here's what I think I would do. If there was a movie I really wanted to see, I'd go see it by myself. But I also think I would try on for size what they were doing. I would start to try to pick out things about the movie that didn't make sense, and try to appreciate the fact that they apparently get a lot out of this. Now, I start off with that story and that example because Professor Sekiguchi from Yamaguchi University said this is one of the biggest differences between how Americans argue and how Japanese argue. Japanese respondents in Professor Sekiguchi's study said logic is too cold, it's too mechanical, and it doesn't touch the heart. So my example of watching a movie and you've got that annoying friend who just won't enjoy the movie, that in some sense, a lot of the people responding in Sekiguchi-sensei's study, they felt that way about logical arguments. Here we are together, we're talking, we're doing business together, we're in a workplace, but here's this person who's just trampling all over our relationships by picking apart what people say. But the thing is, for people from the United States, this is not inappropriate. This is not a social mistake. Professor Ishii Sensei from Otsuma Women's University found that a lot of the Japanese participants in the study said logic is something for college professors. Logic is not for normal people. Normal people having a conversation don't have to pick apart and examine the logic of it. And there is a, not American actually, Canadian researcher named David Livermore. And he pins this down to probably the biggest difference between the United States and Japan culturally. And that is that the United States is individualist and that Japan is collectivist. The United States is individualist, Japan is collectivist. Now here I'm going to interrupt myself for just about 30 seconds. If you at any point have wondered, why is this bald guy here in Japan? What made him come here? Well, I mentioned to you at the first class meeting I've been fascinated by Japan since the 1990s, and I'll tell you why. Because I teach communication classes, and very often the first unit is on culture, and very often the first thing that unit does is it says some cultures are individualist, some cultures are collectivist. And then it says the best example of the contrast is the United States and Japan. The leading researcher of intercultural communication is a man named Kurt Hofstede from the Netherlands. And he said the difference between individualist and collectivist is the most important difference between cultures because it defines your identity. If you come from an individualist culture, who you are is what you choose and you build. If you're from a collectivist culture, it's a lot more true that who you are is what group you belong to. Now, David Livermore took the idea of an individualist culture and a collectivist culture and said, this is why argument is so different. Because in collectivist cultures, the high priority the highest priority in school, when raising kids, is to teach people how to keep an eye on what other people need and am I contributing to the group. But in individualist cultures, you raise your kid to have very good judgment because they're going to leave you. They're going to move out. They're going to move to a completely different part of the world, do a different job from what you did, and when they're far away from you and not even asking for your advice anymore, you want them to make good decisions. So children, students in individualist cultures are trained to think logically and to question other people's logic because they have to be little individual decision-making units because they don't lean on the group nearly as much to help make decisions or to help know what's right and wrong. This is going to bring us, by the way, to the second difference that's influenced by Christianity. So I've been teaching about the difference between individualist and collectivist cultures for decades. 3 years ago, a team of biology professors and economics professors at Harvard published a study in Science Magazine, one of the most rigorous academic journals there is, saying the difference between individualism and collectivism comes from Christianity. I have a copy of the study if you would like to read it. They said in about 500 AD, the Roman Catholic Church laid out a rule and enforced it very strictly. You may not marry cousins, and you may not have multiple wives or multiple husbands. And what that did, in the West, it broke up the extended family clan. And instead of you belonging to a huge family that had a head of the family, a lot of wealth and property passed down through the generations, lots of cousins, lots of aunt and uncles, typically marrying one another and staying in one community, when the Catholic Church said, no marrying cousins, no multiple spouses, the household unit became mom, dad, kids, that's it. And people began moving around to different villages. And the cultural changes that accompanied this, before this happened, and in parts of the world where it didn't happen, children were raised to be loyal. They were raised to conform. They were raised to obey. After the Catholic Church laid down this rule and broke up the extended family clans, children were raised to think analytically. They were raised to act independently, and you were a success when you grew up and became an adult if you went out and did not accept influence from your parents. And most intriguingly of all, in countries where the clans had been broken up by the Catholic Church's rule about marrying cousins, people placed a higher emphasis on treating strangers fairly and trusting them. In parts of the world where the clan was still the community people belonged to, you didn't trust strangers, and you didn't treat strangers the same way. You treated your own people the best. And if someone was outside of your own people, you were cautious about them until they proved themselves. Now, Henrich and his co-authors got this into the most rigorous journal in all of academia, because here's what they were able to show. They went country by country, through Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia. And they measured how long there had been and how strong it had been a Christian influence in that country, and then they correlated it to how high a priority is it that children are raised to be obedient and to conform or to think independently? How much is there an influence of extended clan versus nuclear family? And there was a perfect correlation. They tried that correlation with other things. Style of agriculture, I've heard it said before that Japan is as collective as it is because of the history of rice farming. They tested that explanation. They said that explanation's not nearly as strong as the religious influence. So if you want to understand why are these Americans so weird, why are these Europeans so weird, the most robust explanation we have at this point is the divergence that's rooted in religion. All right. Couple of more things about the orientation to logic. Takeshi Suzuki, who I mentioned and showed you the picture at the beginning, said that for American arguers, the identity of the arguer is not nearly as important. The identity of the arguer is not nearly as important. For Japanese arguers, the status of the person who said something is really important. If it is someone who is the president of a company, or they're older, or, sadly, they're male, or in any one of a number of different ways they have status, then what they say must be true. In the United States, the emphasis is a lot more on what are the merits of what was said. It's less about the relationship, it's more about the content. And we've got a lot of stories that we pass around where someone low in status pointed out something that was true. And if people were wise and listened to this low status person, they benefited. As a matter of fact, one of my areas in the field of communication is listening. And over the past about 20 years, the idea of what makes a good leader has shifted a lot. For a while, we thought of a good leader like a general in the army, who just gives you your orders and you carry them out. And if they have a lot of charisma, and if anything that they organize turns out well, then they're a good leader. Lately, we've come to understand that a leader who listens, the people who are following that leader probably have information that the leader needs. The president of a business that does a lot of sales, that president probably doesn't do much of the selling. But the sales representatives can tell the president of the company what is happening in individual sales meetings. And if the president will listen, that company will do well. The point there is, it's not the person with high status who has the really, really essential things to say. It may be the people with low status. So you may find, when you deal with arguers from the United States, from Europe, there's not as much emphasis on who said it, how powerful are they, how famous are they the leader? You may find they put more emphasis on, well, look what they said. Look at the evidence they have for what they said. And what they said, the logic holds up. Final thing, Oi Kyoko said that American arguers are a lot less likely to use emotional appeals. They're a lot less likely, when arguing, to talk about anyone's emotions. I remember when I was in college, some of our debate topics had to do with laws that were adopted in Japan. And I would read Japanese newspapers and I would read statements made by Japanese government officials. And they would say, we have to pass this law, we have to make this change because people are hurt or people are offended. And that just sounded bizarre to me because I was raised in the United States. We regard emotion as a private matter. This is back then. Things have changed a little since then. You don't, for the most part, make laws based on who has a certain emotional state. And I shouldn't say that you never do it, because in recent years, the United States has done a fair amount of that. That's a longer talk we do not have time for. But what I said at the beginning of class today is it's a matter of, is this done on a daily basis or done once in a while in response to specific circumstances? In the United States, an emotional appeal in an argument is unusual and seems out of place. All right. One last thing I was going to tuck in here before we wrap up talking about the orientation to logic. Last year in my persuasion class at Bushnell University in Oregon, I shared with them the findings of a study of specific appeals that had been put out during the COVID pandemic to try to get people to observe social distancing. And some of these appeals were very successful. Some of these appeals were a complete failure. And I should make sure you know, these are all appeals that were used in the United States. So this will give you an idea of what worked with Americans who were hearing these arguments. This appeal worked well. Public health officials tell us we must slow the spread of the coronavirus so the numbers of sick people won't overwhelm our hospitals. If we don't slow the spread, cases will increase rapidly. They'll suddenly spike beyond what the system can handle. We can do our part to slow the spread by staying inside and avoiding contact with others when we have to go out. If we take action to slow the spread now, we will save lives. That argument did very well. Here's a second one. On average, each person passes on the coronavirus to 2 or 3 people. Those then pass it on to more people, and so on. If you break the chain of transmission, you can single-handedly save lives, potentially dozens of people. Stay home as much as you can and break the transmission chain. Now, can you hear the arguments in there? Can you hear the, if you behave in this way, this will be the result. If you do this, this will be the consequence? Let me share with you 2 of the appeals that didn't work at all, that people responded badly to and didn't like. Social distancing is what everybody else in your community is doing. So please support them so their efforts don't go to waste. That fell completely flat. And the other one, social distancing is what the government has asked us to do. So please do it in order to be in compliance along with the rest of the community. Terrible argument for American audiences. You walk them through why it works, what happens, with a lot of developed explanation, they love it. You talk about what's going to put them in the same pattern as other people. They don't want to be like other people. They want to make their own decisions. All right. So Americans think of examining logic and making logical arguments and pointing out flaws in other people's logic as fine in almost any conversation. It's not rude to pick apart a movie if the people picking apart a movie are having fun doing it and they all enjoy it together. And Americans making arguments and dissecting what one another say, they were brought up to it. Okay. Third, conversational arguing. Conversational arguing. This refers to family members, close friends, work colleagues, romantic partners. We defined argument 3 different ways last week. We said you could come up with a bunch of arguments for why you should buy a bicycle instead of a car, and then we used this picture and said you and someone else might have a conversation that went on for an hour where you tried to work through your disagreement, and you later said, well, we had an argument over it, but we settled it in the end. This is what I'm talking about when I say conversational argument. Suzuki Shinobu said, one of the ways you can tell the difference between Japanese arguing and American arguing, and I just realized this would have been a good term to put on the PowerPoint, but I didn't. Japanese organize their arguments climactically, and I will explain what that means. Americans, the organization is anti-climactic. Climactic is actually It's this word with the suffix changed. Climax. Climax is the highest point. It's the peak. Movies tend to start off slow and build until they reach a climax. Songs tend to start off slow and build and build and build until they reach a climax. Japanese arguers tend to give a lot of their reasons, a lot of their evidence, and then at the end, finally say what the point is. So, a simple life is a relaxing life. Being ready for anything is a very, very peaceful and healthy way to live. Having more money in your pocket is just a way to have fewer worries. Raindrops actually feel really good on bare skin. You know, you really should just shave your head. I gave multiple reasons, and I told you what I was driving at the end. And according to Suzuki-sensei's research, that's characteristic of Japanese arguing. American arguing is anticlimactic, which is to say, if you saw a movie and the big twist in the movie happened in the first 30 seconds and then the movie went on for 2 hours, that wouldn't be a very good movie. That's how Americans argue. You should shave your head. Simplifies things, and simple is a good way to live. You got more money in your pocket because you don't need haircuts or shampoo or anything. Raindrops feel really good on bare skin. I tell you up front what I want you to believe. From last week, claim, warrant, grounds, I give you the claim as the first thing out of my mouth. That's anticlimactic arguing. Come right out and say it. That's one example that fits a larger pattern. Americans, when they argue, are a lot more direct. Japanese arguers tend to be a lot less direct. Oi Sensei says, Japanese arguers, their claims will be milder. So instead of, you should shave your head, it might be, shaving your head might sound extreme, but there are some advantages to it that maybe you might want to consider. So I put a whole lot of qualifiers into that claim. But that's characteristic. The claim is made in a much milder way with milder language. And Oi Sensei also said, often the warrant and the backing are not explicitly included. They're left, you may remember the very long word I gave you last week, they're left as an enthymeme. They're left for the listeners to fill in themselves. Oi Sensei also mentioned that what's typical of Japanese arguers, I'm trying to think how much of this I can explain in about 5 or 10 minutes. Japanese communication is regarded as listener responsible. American communication is regarded as speaker responsible. These terms were coined by linguists at the University of Hawaii in about 1997. What this means is, Japanese arguers are socialized typically to pay careful attention, think very hard about what they're hearing, and if they don't understand what was said, they didn't listen well. Americans are raised and socialized to believe it's the speaker's responsibility to lay everything out. And if you don't understand what the speaker was trying to say, then they didn't speak well. Arguers in the United States know this. They are therefore very blatant, which can seem very confrontational. The one last thing to say about that, it's typical for people to be indirect and trust that the people hearing the argument will fill it in when they're relationally very close. If you've ever had such a close friend that the two of you talked in inside jokes that made no sense to anybody else, but both of you knew what they were. And you could just shoot each other a look, and you'd both start laughing. Because from that look, you would know there was some memory that you were both referring to. If you've been in that situation. Groups that have that kind of relationship, that kind of closeness, they do communicate a lot more indirectly. Communicating directly and spelling everything out, that's what you do with someone who's brand new and you don't know them very well. I know, because people have been having to spell a lot of things out for me. Yesterday was my 3-week mark in Japan, and a lot of people have had to go step by step in explaining things because I am so new and so different. So in the individualist culture of the United States, our arguments spell everything out because we don't have the same degree of relational closeness, and we don't put as much emphasis on protecting relationships as you would in Japan. Japan, the culture largely is more homogeneous. People are more similar, have more shared experiences. That makes it possible to argue indirectly. And there's more emphasis on not disrupting harmony. So for both those reasons, being indirect is successful argument. That brings us then, wait a minute. Oh gosh, I almost forgot the entire back half of this. That would have been bad. Okay, 2 more things to say about what happens in conversational argument. American arguers do more proving. They do more, this statement is true because. Here's evidence for it, and explanations that go the other direction. Arguments people might make that would disagree with me, they're wrong. Western arguers do a lot more of that. So here's a Western argument having to do with getting enough sleep. I might say, you should get 8 hours of sleep every night because the science tells us what your brain does while you are asleep is it consolidates all of your sensory input and it sorts it out and it strengthens the memory of the important part. And you're enrolled in college. You're trying to learn. You're studying. You want to get good grades and come out of here having learned things. Sleep is vital for that. And some people might say, if I cut my sleep short, I can get more work done. But if you spend more time studying and not sleeping, and the not sleeping means the studying doesn't do any good, then that's not a wise use of your study time. You'd be better off sleeping. That's a very Western argument. You should do it because here's more evidence. Here are the logical relationships. According to Suzuki's study, this is what a typical Japanese argument would sound like, and she called this a horizontal argument. You should get 8 hours of sleep every night. Now, I'm not talking about sleep on a train. I mean deep, uninterrupted sleep in your bed with your lights turned off and the phone in the other room. You can do this by having a regular bedtime and just by making choices which things are important and which aren't. She said what's common with Japanese arguers is more explanation, more teaching it. Here's how to do it. Here's what it is. Here's what it looks like. Here's how I make sure you don't misunderstand it. Here's how to do it. And with American arguers, there's a lot more digging into, here's the evidence, here's why. Some people might object that this is not true, but they're wrong because. And she called that vertical argument. Oi Sensei said, if you gave American students a really controversial, difficult topic, they were more likely to say, this problem is so complex that I don't want to mess this up. This problem is so complex that a single position would not do justice to it. This problem is so complicated that there's not one position that's the right position. But in that same study, Japanese arguers said, I see merit in lots of different positions, and I really can't make up my mind. So American arguers would talk about the position itself, can it be defended? And Japanese arguers were a lot more likely in that situation to say, I accept and endorse and can agree with people who have lots of different positions. And the final one, and this is the third and final difference influenced by Christianity. Oi Sensei, for one of her studies, gave American arguers and Japanese arguers the exact same question. Do you believe terminally ill people who have an incurable disease and they're in pain and they're going to die, do you believe that they should be allowed to commit suicide with the help of a doctor, painlessly and with the help of a doctor? And Japanese arguers argued either way, yes, I think they should, no, I don't think they should, with a variety of different ways that they developed their position. Americans very commonly said, no, they shouldn't, because life is precious, because we're made in God's image. And Oi Sensei said, American arguers, even ones who do not identify as Christian, they'll spontaneously pop out the teachings of the Christian Bible, because you can't get away from it, because it is in the foundation of what they were taught about right and wrong. If you're going to understand arguments, so many argumentative situations have to do with not only what's right and what's wrong, but where did that right and wrong come from? And who gets to say if two people disagree, if something is wrong, who gets to decide which side is right? Is stealing wrong? Typically, yes. Would you steal food to feed a starving child if there were no other food available? I don't know about you, but I would. Those arguments can get very slippery. And in those situations, Oi Sensei said, American arguers will go to the Bible, even if they themselves aren't Christian. Japanese arguers, a lot less likely. All right, that got us to the end of the conversational argument behaviors, bringing us finally to some of the stuff I found the most interesting. How Japanese debaters, trained debaters, argue differently. This is also kind of a short point. Japanese debaters, okay, you remember how we said in conversational arguments, Japanese arguers, they were a lot more indirect. They might not provide the backing or the grounds. They would just provide the claim. They made kind of these abbreviated, short arguments, not very developed. Japanese debaters did the opposite. Absolute opposite. American debaters, they'd make an argument quickly in as few words as possible. They'd say what the claim was, and they would quickly mention what the grounds and maybe the warrant were. Japanese debaters were very, very careful to have a complete Toulmin model argument. Claim, warrant, grounds, backing, qualifier, rebuttal, whole thing every time. They were meticulous about it. And the team of researchers, the team of primarily American debate coaches who carried out this study, they said that it was largely because the Japanese debaters almost regarded arguing as an extension of English being their second language. That arguing was a second language. And they would be very, very careful to do it properly. Have you ever met anybody who you could tell Japanese was not their first language, and you could really tell they learned it from a book? Because they're using all the polite forms all the time, and they just don't talk like Japanese people talk? In these studies, Japanese debaters sounded like that compared to American debaters. American students We're encouraged to argue in classes. We're encouraged to argue at the dinner table at night. Out on the playground playing with other kids, lots of arguments. And so, you remember when we defined argument, the 3 different ways. The one on the right was playing it like a game. And my example that day was a lawyer in court. This is also playing argument like a game. But if you've never played the game before, and it's something you use as an exercise to try to develop intercultural competence, you may turn out to be very, very stiff and formal, not comfortable, not confident, always not quite sure you're doing it right. And I was struck by the big difference between that and what happened in conversational argument, where the arguments were less developed. So, in the United States, in conversational arguments, you can develop the arguments in great detail. You can give lots of evidence. You can pick apart the logic of what someone else is saying. I have dear friends I think the world of who will just chat with me about a movie we both saw, and I'll say what I thought, and they'll say, well, that makes no sense. If it were like that, why wouldn't this be true? And that's polite conversation. But when I was coaching debaters would make arguments in a lot fewer words, and we would all know what they were talking about because all our lives we'd been around a lot of arguing. So what? I learned years ago, a good academic should always be able to answer the question, so what? You may get to the end of hearing all this and think, so what? If you are going to communicate, work alongside Westerners, the Japanese Ministry of Education says the number 1 need that English language learners in Japan have right now is being comfortable with assertiveness. And there is a model of how you grow in ability, how you grow in competence. This model was coined by a management trainer named Martin Broadwell about the year I was born. And I think I will put this word on the board. I think it may help. What we are talking about here is competence. If the word is not familiar, it just means you can do something and you can do it successfully. If you've been to medical school and had training as a surgeon, then you are competent to be a surgeon. If not, and someone just hands you a knife and says, go save someone's life, you're not competent. I messed that up. Hold on 2 seconds. Okay. There are 4 stages in this model of competence, and after I walk you through them, I'll tell you what the point of this entire day was. There is, first of all, unconscious incompetence. Unconscious incompetence. Mukama aku kimu aku kise, mukama aqua kizumasuse aku kwachuwekisa, mukama akuimu sizumasoge akue mirembe. Anyone agree with that? That was all in a language spoken in Uganda called Luganda. And I'm betting, until I started speaking it a moment ago and then named it, I'm betting almost everybody in here had never heard of it. And you have no idea what I said. So until a second ago, you were incompetent in Luganda language and you didn't even know it existed. Unconscious incompetence. Once you know that it exists and you don't understand a word of it, you've reached the stage of conscious incompetence. Mukama aqua kizumachu. I gotta practice that one. Mukama akuimu sizumaku amasuke akue mirembe. Now you know that that's Luganda, and you know you don't understand a word of it. What if you were to study it for a while? And I know at Suda we have a fair number of students studying languages. you would reach a stage of conscious competence. Conscious competence is where you can do something, but you have to concentrate on it the whole time. A newborn baby cannot ride a bicycle and does not know that they can't ride a bicycle. They don't know bicycles exist. A toddler first sees all the big kids riding around on bicycles. They know they're too little to ride a bicycle. They know bicycles exist and they can't ride one. You ever see someone who's learning to ride a bicycle? And they reach this stage where they can ride a bicycle, but they're very wobbly, and they have to think about what they're doing the whole time? Conscious competence. If you can speak English, but you have to concentrate on every word, and you have to constantly translate it, you've reached conscious competence. Then you can reach unconscious competence. You have unconscious competence speaking Japanese. You can halfway listen to someone talking, then play back what they just said and get the gist of it. I can't do that. I can sometimes understand a little Japanese if I concentrate on every word. One point that the researchers made in this study is that Japanese debaters had only reached a state of conscious competence. They could debate if they followed the rules of arguing like a recipe. What you're going to have when you get to the end of this class is the beginnings of conscious competence at arguing. Because you'll have been in a couple of argument situations, you'll have a little vocabulary, you'll have a framework for what an argument should look like. If you want to reach unconscious competence, where arguing feels natural and comfortable, and you don't have to switch gears in your brain to do it, you need to seek out situations where it happens. Colleges have teams. I don't know if SUDA has one. I don't know if they have a club or a circle devoted to arguing. I know that a lot of colleges, students decide they want one, so they just invent one. And they get together, and they make a list of topics every week, and they just take turns, and they put some time limits on the speeches, and they just go back and forth. And the more you do it, the more you practice it. It's not that different from learning to speak a language. If all you do is read the textbooks and go to the classes, you're going to talk like you learned it from a book. But if you move among people who do it, you will at some point be able to think in it without translating. And when you can do that, that's when you can work alongside Westerners, and this tendency they have to argue about everything, it won't throw you off. You'll recognize what they're doing, and you can argue back and not worry that it's going to somehow damage the relationship, because that's just what they do. So, let us now remind ourselves the differences were approach and avoid, the orientation to logic, conversational arguer behaviors, and a very short point about differences in debating behavior. And then let's come back. The difference in orientation to logic that Japanese arguers and Western arguers tend to have. We camped out there for quite a while. If you can consolidate what we've said about that, you should be able to do a good job on that question. The differences in argument behavior that Japanese debaters show. They make longer, more formal arguments compared to everyday Japanese argument. They make shorter, more understated arguments. And third and finally, the differences in Japanese and Western argument behavior that are influenced by Christianity. There was the approach and avoid, which came down to Confucian versus biblical teaching. There was the orientation to logic, which had its roots in individualism versus collectivism, which has its roots in Christianity. And then there was Western arguers will use Christian teachings, even if they're not Christian, as their authority for right and wrong. You hit those points, you nailed that essay question. I'm going to pause here for a second and see, do you have anything you want to ask me? right. At the first class meeting, and actually the first two class meetings, I had something I did at the end. I did it in English at the first class meeting and very sloppily at the end of the second class meeting. And last week, I just got wrapped up in stuff and forgot to do it at all. But it is the one expression of my faith that I'm going to inflict on you, and it consists just of blessing you. I'm going to do it real quick, and then I'm going to dismiss class. Shu ga anata o shukufuku shi, anata o mamororemasu you ni. Shu ga mika o anata ni terashi, anata o megumarimasu you ni. Shu ga mika o anata ni muke, anata ni heian o ataeraremasu you ni. You have a few minutes. I'm going to put the table back of who's partnered with who. You can take these few minutes if you want, and you can connect up with whoever your new partners are, and then when you hear the chime go, class is over. Whoops, that's not right. Come on. Do that. Okay, ready, set, go.